Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, January 27th. The world gathered today to honor the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in Poland.
Not 80 years ago, we saw Jewish children slaughtered, once again, for one reason: because they were born Jewish. In a very fundamental way, what happened in Israel on October 7th and what happened here at Auschwitz have one common thread: the age-old hatred of Jews. On January 27th, 1945, when the Red Army entered these gates, the world finally saw where the step-by-step progression of anti-Semitism leads. It leads right here. The gas chambers, the piles of bodies, and the horrors within these gates. Today, we see eerie parallels throughout the world, throughout Europe, North America, even Australia. Jewish students have been singled out and threatened in universities. Today, Jewish professors have been fired. Today, Jewish children have been told to hide any outward signs of being Jewish. Today, there are mass demonstrations against Jews. Today, we see vile comments all over social media.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in attendance and said that it was an honor to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the camp's liberation. Speaking in Krakow, Mr. Trudeau says that we all have a responsibility to remember what happened at the Nazi extermination camp and the Holocaust, and to say, quote, never again. Historians estimate more than 1 million people, mostly Jews, were killed at the Auschwitz camp during the Second World War. And in Ottawa, politicians and leaders from the Jewish community gathered for a Holocaust remembrance ceremony. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre spoke on the importance of remembering those lost in the Holocaust.
The 80th anniversary of the liberation of the prisoners in Auschwitz-Birkenau has a special and important meaning to me. About 15 years ago, I was tasked with representing the government of Canada at the March of the Living, which is an inspiring gathering of survivors and Jewish youth who walk from Auschwitz, the first concentration camp, to nearby Birkenau, which was by far the most prolific. We walked arms locked. I was privileged to be with a survivor who was over 80 years old. And when we arrived at the gates of Birkenau, he stopped suddenly and he said, "That's where he stood." And he pointed into the air. He said, "When I was a little boy, I walked in here, and there was Dr. Mengele." And Dr. Mengele, with the wave of a hand, would decide what would happen to each prisoner after a glance. Would they go immediately to the gas chamber, or would they be enslaved to days or weeks more intensive labor?
Mr. Poilievre also spoke at length about the importance of supporting Israel in its war against Hamas, and used his time at the podium to criticize the Liberal government for its inability to deal with rising anti-Semitism after the October 7th massacre.
We had all hoped that we had left the ugly authoritarian socialist ideologies of fascism and communism behind, but they came roaring back with extreme and radical movements. New threats emanating from Iran metastasized and exploded back into the forefront on October 7th. An unprovoked attack that was deliberately designed to carry out the maximum amount of cruelty against the most innocent people. We see on our own streets anti-Semitism guided by obscene, woke ideologies that have led to an explosion in hate crimes. Hate crimes were up over 100% in Canada before October 7th. Now they're up 251%, with Jews being the principal victims of those crimes. We must not just condemn these things, we must take action against them.
Coming up next, 4 Israeli hostages who were serving in Israel's military have returned to Israel. Stay tuned. On Saturday, 4 Israeli hostages who were serving in the Israeli military were returned to Israel. Soon after their release, the IDF released footage of the freed hostages being embraced by their loved ones after 477 days in Hamas captivity. However, despite the good news, Israel accused Hamas of going back on the ceasefire agreement for violating the requirement that female civilian hostages be the first to be released.
Hamas failed to meet its obligations to first release Israeli female civilian hostages as part of the agreement. We are determined to return to the return of Arbel Yahud, an Israeli citizen kidnapped from Nir Oz, and also Shiri Bivas and her 2 children, Kfir and Ariel, whose welfare we are extremely concerned about.
But this morning, a spokesperson for Israel's prime minister confirmed that the dispute has now been resolved and changes have been made to the ceasefire plan.
Hamas had backtracked on the agreement by not releasing Arbel as they had agreed originally. Subsequently, an additional phase of hostage releases are scheduled to take place this Thursday. Following the settling of this violation, Israel this morning agreed to the passage of Gazan residents to the north of Gaza. In accordance with the agreement, 3 additional hostages will be released this Saturday. Allow me to share with you some more confirmed details, facts and figures. I can confirm that Israel has received from the Hamas terrorist organization, a list that includes the status of all of the 33 hostages due to be released in this first stage. The list from Hamas matches Israel's intelligence. So I can share with you that 25 of our hostages are alive and 8 have been killed by Hamas.
Israeli citizen spokesperson and former Israeli member of parliament, Dr. Einat Wilf, joined us to unpack the debate over the young boys and their mother who have not yet been released by Hamas.
So quite a while ago, Hamas released a hostage video of Yarden Bibas, the father, saying that his wife, the mother, and his 2 children, the young boys, were killed by Israel in an air raid. Of course, this is typical of Hamas, not mentioning that they were actually kidnapped and placed in danger by Hamas itself. But this is something that they issued quite a while ago, but they haven't said anything since. And we know, for example, that a few weeks ago, there was news that one of the female soldiers, Danielle, was killed in an air raid, and then we know that she was released alive. So there's a kind of fog around the fate of the Bibas family, the wife, and the children. Now, we know that whereas in the beginning it was important for Hamas to ensure that a whole list of murderers are released from Israeli jails, as a result of the war, what became their number one priority is to take the Gazans who were evacuated south in the beginning of the war and to enable them to return to the north. That became their number one priority. And in the deal, which, is really mostly extortion and ransom, they were able to achieve that the Gazans will return to the north fairly early in the deal. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they made sure that Israelis are happy and elated, seeing the women soldiers alive and freed, so that they get their number one priority, the return of the evacuated Gazans to the north. And then, and only then, will they release the information about who is dead. I think they probably correctly assessed that if it will be clearly known and confirmed that the mother and the two children, the Bibas mother and the two children, were indeed killed in Hamas captivity, Israelis might be less inclined to carry out the terms of the ransom and especially the return of the evacuated Gazans to the north.
All right, stay tuned. Coming up after the break, we'll have our weekly Caldwell segment, where the director of Caldwell Securities Limited will be joining me to discuss what Trump's tariff threat means for Canada's financial wellness. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. We're just under a month into 2025, and there is a lot of turmoil politically that could have an impact on your finances. Parliament in Ottawa is prorogued while the Liberals host their leadership contest. And at the same time, Canada is just 5 days away from Donald Trump's threat of tariffs. The question lingers. What does the threat of tariffs mean for Canada's economy and financial wellness? We're now joined by Brendan Caldwell, director at Caldwell Securities Limited, to unpack exactly that. Brendan, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Should be a good one, Teresa.
Now, with President Trump's first week in office under our belts and a potential Canadian election on the horizon, it's safe to say there's a lot to recap only a month into 2025. So what would you say some key moments in 2025 have been, and how are they going to influence Canada's financial wellness?
Well, obviously, President Trump taking office Monday of last week was, as they would say, kind of a big deal, or as he would say, huge. I think I will pause you, and we can bet on this. You said an imminent Canadian election. I do not think there will be an imminent Canadian election. I think the most likely scenario is that whether Chrysler Freeland or Mark Carney, who would seem to be the two most likely candidates, end up as the new Liberal leader and thereby becoming prime minister. I don't think that the NDP is going to force an election anytime soon after that. I expect that it'll be no sooner than the summer and probably the autumn before we actually have an election here. The election in Ontario, however, is apparently coming much, much sooner. So I think even the Ontario government knows that it's got some time, because the feds will not be calling elections soon. To your question about Mr. Trump becoming president, he has made a lot of pronouncements, including getting a 25% tariff up against the Canadians, and as well as many other countries. But not surprisingly, he hasn't done anything about it, because I think, like annexing Greenland, it's one thing to say a thing, it's another thing to actually get her done. And I think there's a ways between here and getting her done in terms of tariffs on Canada.
Now, on that topic of tariffs, the worry right now is, what is Canada supposed to do? So what happens if Canada proposes a similar 25% trade tariff on the U.S.? What industries do you think will be most affected?
Well, I think all of Canada will be affected. I do think that a knee-jerk reaction is probably not the right one, just because on a day one, February 1st or whenever, if the U.S. were to do something or another country were to do something, it doesn't mean that we need to do something right back. It should mean that we have a parliament where stuff can be debated. I do think it objectionable, to say the least, that during this very important time, for the sake of Liberal Party continuity, that they've decided to have a suspend Parliament like they were King Charles I or something, while they get their act together. So I do think we should have a deliberated, coordinated approach as a country. To borrow from an American founding father, I think Ben Franklin, if we do not hang together, we shall all surely hang separately. So I don't think that the provinces running off and creating their own foreign policy, the United States, is the right way of doing it, because there's nothing more that President Trump would like than divide and conquer.
And with President Trump's inauguration and the launch of his and Melania's cryptocurrencies, Trump and Melania Coin, how do you think regulations and the markets will respond to cryptocurrencies moving forward?
Well, generally the markets have been favorable. I believe I know the Trump coin did extraordinarily well in the days leading up to the inauguration. May have come back down somewhat here. I don't know the exact prices, but there has certainly been a more favorable attitude toward the so-called cryptocurrencies. I think there may be some bubble in them at the moment. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some settling down of those. I think it remains to be seen this new revelation out of China, this new AI platform called DeepSeek,
Mhm.
which has rattled markets, the tech markets and the crypto markets in specific. I think it remains to be seen what the impact of that's going to be, but I think it'll be interesting all around what the reaction will be. I think we're probably at peak Bitcoin right now for the moment.
Well, Brent, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Teresa.
All right, don't go anywhere. Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. Ontario MP Chandra Arya has been disqualified from the running in the Liberal leadership race. CN Railways signals and communications employees could begin striking as early as tomorrow morning. And U.S. President Trump claims victory against a tariff showdown with Colombia. These stories and more news right after the break. Industry Minister Francois Philippe Champagne is throwing his support behind Mark Carney to become the next Liberal leader and Prime Minister. Champagne says he shares the same economic vision as the former central banker. A number of cabinet ministers and current Liberal MPs are backing Mr. Carney, including Defense Minister Bill Blair, Transport Minister Anita Anand, and Housing Minister Nate Erskine-Smith. The Liberal Party is set to choose its new leader on March 9th. Liberal leadership hopeful Chandra Arya says that the party did not approve his candidacy and has informed him that he's out of the running to be its next leader. The Ontario MP says that he's now waiting on official communication from the Liberals and considering his next steps. Mr. Arya said in a statement on social media that he believes the party's decision raises significant questions about the legitimacy of the leadership race. He was one of the first party members to announce his candidacy to replace Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The union that represents about 750 employees at Canadian National Railway who work in signals and communications could strike as early as Tuesday morning. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers says it was given CN a 72-hour strike notice. CN says it's focused on keeping the supply chain moving and has a contingency plan in place. The CIA now believes the virus responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic most likely originated from a laboratory. An assessment from the agency is pointing the finger at China while also acknowledging that it has low confidence in its own conclusion. The findings were declassified and released on the orders of President Donald Trump's new CIA boss, John Ratcliffe, who was sworn in on Thursday. The results are not based on any new intelligence. The White House is claiming victory in a showdown with Colombia over accepting flights of deported migrants from the U.S. The claim came hours after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened steep tariffs on imports like coffee and flowers and other sanctions on the longtime U.S. partner. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said late Sunday that Colombia's government has agreed to all of Mr. Trump's terms, including what she called, quote, the unrestricted acceptance of all illegal aliens from Colombia returned from the U.S., including on U.S. military aircraft. Liberal leadership candidate Chrystia Freeland says that Canada needs to release a $200 billion plan to retaliate against U.S. President Donald Trump's threatened tariffs. Ms. Freeland says that Ottawa must immediately publish a consultation on detailed dollar-for-dollar retaliation plan that includes Florida oranges, Wisconsin dairy, and Michigan dishwashers on its list of targets. The European Union is rejecting the legitimacy of the presidential election in Belarus on Sunday and are considering new sanctions against the Eastern European nation. The EU insists an orchestrated vote guaranteed 70-year-old Alexander Lukashenko another term on top of his 3 decades in power. They also urge the Belarusian government to release political prisoners, estimating there are over 1,000. Detainees include an employee of the EU delegation in Belarus's capital of Minsk. British Columbia-based environmental activist Zain Haq has been deported back to Pakistan following the expiry of a temporary residency permit and a failed bid by his Canadian wife to sponsor him to stay. The couple had been living together in Vancouver, but Mr. Hack pleaded guilty to mischief charges in 2023 over his role in environmental protests that blocked Metro Vancouver roadways. He was granted a temporary resident permit last spring, but it expired in October, and his challenge for deportation in federal court was unsuccessful. A Canadian who went missing in the capital of Afghanistan last November has made it safely to the other side of the Persian Gulf in Qatar. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly said David Lavery is in good spirits in Qatar with the help of the Qatari government. The Canadian Armed Forces veteran went missing in Kabul, where he'd been working with the Veterans Transition Network providing humanitarian assistance. The group believed he'd been detained by the Taliban-run Afghan government. And the stage has been set for Super Bowl 59, with the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles going head-to-head. Patrick Mahomes brought in 3 touchdowns to help the Chiefs beat the Buffalo Bills 23-29, with the hope of becoming the first team ever to hoist the Lombardi Trophy 3 straight times. Jalen Hurts and the Eagles are in the Super Bowl for the second time in 3 seasons with a big 55-23 win over the Washington Commanders. The 55 points are the most any team has scored in a conference championship game since the 1970 merger. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website at thenewsforum.ca and make sure to follow us on social media. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the Newsforum YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us on Forum Daily News. We'll see you next time. Good night, Canada.